The wind blew softly across the dry hills of Willow Creek, whispering through the sagebrush like an old friend with secrets to tell. A few weathered ranch houses sat scattered in the distance, some half faded into the land like they belonged more to the past than the present. And on the very edge of town, where the gravel road turned to dust, stood a modest farmhouse with shutters painted the color of faded dreams. Her name was Mara Ellison, 45, widowed for 12 years, no children, no family left to speak of. Folks in town said she had become too set in her ways, too quiet, too proud, and most often, too old to catch anyone's eye. But Mara never asked to be noticed. She rose each morning before the sun, brewed her coffee with hands that had learned patience, and worked the small plot of land her husband left behind. What she grew fed herself and sometimes a few neighbors. What she made, jams, hand-stitched quilts, herbal salves, she sold quietly at the Sunday market, never asking for more than fair coin. If anyone ever asked how she was doing, she'd smile kindly and answer, "Still breathing, still grateful." But no one ever asked what she dreamed of anymore, not until the day he rode into town. His name was Calder Row, a tall, silent cowboy with a broad chest, gray in his beard, and a horse that looked like it had seen more country than most men. Calder wasn't looking for a woman. He wasn't even looking for a home. Folks said he came from out near Dry Hollow, or maybe farther still. But the truth was, no one really knew where he'd been. Just that he came through like wind over canyon walls, quiet, steady, with something behind his eyes that made people pause. Mara saw him first from the back porch. He was watering his horse at the trough by the old livery, back turned to her but posture calm, like he belonged even in a place he'd just arrived. She wasn't sure why she stared. Maybe it was the way he moved with quiet assurance. Maybe it was how he took his hat off when the stable boy walked past, showing respect no one expected. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. A feeling she hadn't let herself feel in over a decade. A curiosity that stirred like an ember refusing to die. She shook the thought away. Mara Ellison was 45. Too old for foolish hopes. Too wise for longing. But Calder Row didn't believe in too late. And he didn't believe in fading quietly. Not when he saw her. Not when their eyes met 3 days later at the market. Not when she looked away first, but smiled. And just like that, the story began. Not with a kiss. Not with a storm. But with a look. And a woman who still had something beautiful left to give. The Sunday market in Willow Creek wasn't much to speak of by city standards. A handful of tents, some rickety tables, baked pies sweating under muslin cloth, and locals swapping news between sips of lemonade. But to Mara, it was tradition. It was community. It was where she reminded herself that she still belonged to something, even if no one asked her to dance anymore. That morning, Mara set up her booth like she always did. Quilted goods folded neat as prayers, jars of lavender honey glinting in the sun, and a fresh pot of peppermint balm simmering in a copper pot. She wore her usual navy skirt, the one that swished just above her boots, and a linen blouse with sleeves rolled to her elbows. She didn't dress to be noticed. She never did. But Calder noticed. He approached slow, like he respected the quiet around her. His boots made soft crunching sounds on the gravel path. His hat was in his hand again, and when she finally looked up from straightening her jars, she met eyes so steady they made her forget what she was doing. "Ma'am," he said with a nod. Mara raised a brow. "Not used to being called that." He smiled gently. "Then what should I call you?" She hesitated, watching the creases in his face shift with warmth. Mara Ellison. Calder Row," he said, extending a weathered hand. His shake was firm, respectful. No rush, no pressure, just presence. "What brings you to Willow Creek, Mr. Row?" He glanced toward the ridgeline. "Looking for quiet. Maybe a fence to fix. Maybe a porch to sit on for a while. Plenty of both round here." "I noticed." He paused. "I noticed your work, too." She followed his eyes to the quilt laid over her table. A simple patchwork, but with hand-stitched corners and threads dyed from wildflowers she gathered herself. "You sew?" "I mend," she replied, "and make things that last." Calder nodded, as if that answered more than the question. "This one's got weight to it. Feels like something someone could carry for years." Mara's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. No one had ever spoken about her quilts that way. He bought it without asking the price. Didn't haggle. Didn't say a word more than, "I'll take it." But when his fingers brushed hers as he passed the coins, her skin prickled like someone had struck a match under her ribs. She watched him walk away, the folded quilt slung over his arm like it meant something. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. That night, Mara sat on her porch long after sunset, the stars like soft pinpricks overhead, a mug of tea cooling in her hands. She told herself not to think of him, but her fingers still tingled, and her heart, a heart she thought had closed its doors, was stirring again, knocking gently, as if to say, "You're not done yet." The days after the market passed slowly, like warm honey over fresh cornbread, quiet, steady, and unexpectedly sweet. Mara kept to her routines, though something inside her had shifted. She still rose early, fed the chickens, tended the herbs by the window, and stitched beneath the elm tree in the yard. But her thoughts wandered now. They wandered to a man with dust on his boots and gentleness in his voice, to a man who had noticed her, not for what she once was, but for who she still could be. It had been years since someone lingered in conversation with her, years since a man had looked at her like he wasn't in a hurry, and years since she had caught herself brushing her hair with care before going into town. Then came Tuesday morning. She was in the garden when she heard the hoofbeats. Slow, unhurried, not a delivery boy, not the sheriff. She looked up just as Calder Row reined in his horse at the front gate. He tipped his hat. "Didn't mean to startle you." "You didn't," she said, brushing soil from her hands. "Well, not much." He dismounted like a man used to the rhythm of the land, every motion measured, nothing wasted. "I was hoping," he said, "you might have use for a pair of hands. I noticed that stretch of fence along your southern field is slumped." Mara blinked. That part of the fence had been falling in sections, but she hadn't had the strength or the pride to ask for help. "I don't pay much," she said, arms crossed out of habit. "I'm not asking much," Calder replied. "I just like to feel useful." There was something in the way he said it that made her chest ache just a little. She nodded once, then motioned with her chin. "Tools are in the shed. Nails might be short, but there's good wood in the stack." And just like that, he got to work. He didn't ask questions, didn't brag about how he knew what he was doing, didn't break the silence unless it was to comment on the shape of the land or the way the breeze smelled like clover. Mara found herself watching him from the porch, her sewing forgotten in her lap. She wasn't studying his strength, not just that. She was watching his rhythm, the way he moved without hurry, the way he handled broken boards with care, not contempt, the way he worked like the world hadn't yet taught him to rush through things worth doing right. At noon, she brought him water and a sandwich. He accepted both with a thank you and a quiet smile. And when he sat down on the porch steps to eat, she joined him. "You always fix strangers' fences?" she asked, half smiling. He chewed thoughtfully, then looked out at the horizon. "Not always, but sometimes. You ride into a place that feels like it's been waiting for you." The words hung in the air between them, unspoken and true, and Mara didn't laugh. She didn't look away, because something in her chest whispered the same thing. Maybe her life hadn't ended at 45. Maybe it was just unfolding now. For the next few days, Calder kept showing up. He never said he would. He never made promises. But every morning, just as the mist began to lift from the meadows, his horse would come clip-clopping down the road like it already knew the way. Mara stopped asking why. He fixed the sagging gate, rehung the barn door, repaired the step she'd been meaning to get to for months, always with a quiet calm, never expecting anything in return. In return, Mara brewed strong coffee. She set out 2 cups instead of 1. She offered fresh bread when she had it, and quiet company when words weren't needed. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, her world stopped feeling so still. One evening, after a full day of hauling and hammering, Calder didn't leave right away. The sun was beginning to set in bands of orange and lavender over the hills, and Mara was wiping her hands on her apron when she saw him sitting on the porch bench, hat on his knee, watching the sky like it had something to say. "You always this patient?" she asked, stepping outside. Calder looked over, a slight grin pulling at his mouth. "Only when the view's worth it." She rolled her eyes, but her smile gave her away. She sat beside him, a safe few inches of space between them. Her hands were calloused but clean, her eyes lined by years but bright with something new. For a long moment, they didn't speak. Then he said, almost to the horizon, "You know, folks like to say life has a rhythm, but most of what I've seen, it's just a series of starts and stops. You think it's going one way, then you hit a fence or a storm or just plain loneliness." Mara glanced at him. "You've known loneliness?" He nodded once, enough to recognize it in someone else. She swallowed. The truth sat close in her throat, but it didn't feel sharp anymore. "Just honest. I got used to the quiet after Eli passed," she said softly. Too used to it, maybe. Somewhere along the way, I convinced myself this was all there'd be. Calder turned to her then, fully, with eyes that didn't look through her, but into her. "That's where folks go wrong," he said. "Thinking the book's closed just 'cause a chapter ended." Mara looked down at her hands. "What if people don't want to read the rest of your pages?" He chuckled low. "Then they're missing the best part." Her heart thudded once, hard. She didn't blush. She didn't flutter. But something deep inside her softened like soil after rain. She stood then gently and said, "I made stew. There's plenty." He rose without hesitation. "I'll take a seat at your table, if you'll have me." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Mara set 2 bowls, 2 spoons, and 1 extra place at the table that used to feel too big. And it didn't feel too big anymore. The days stretched into weeks, and by the time the cottonwood trees began to whisper with late summer wind, Calder had become part of Mara's world like a familiar song she hadn't heard in years, but still knew every word to. He never stayed overnight, never crossed a line, but his presence lingered. In the extra chair on the porch, in the sound of his hammer repairing things she'd stopped believing were worth fixing, and in the steady rhythm of his voice reading aloud to her some evenings from the worn books she kept in the parlor. One Saturday, as she packed her jars for the market, Calder leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching her with a kind of quiet pride. "You ever think about growing that patch of land behind the barn?" he asked. She glanced at him, then out the window. "That old spot's dry. Too many rocks. I gave up trying years ago." "Sometimes it's not the land," he said, "just the hands working it. Or maybe it just needs someone to believe it can still bloom." She stopped, the lid to her crate halfway closed, and stared at him. "You talking about the field?" she said slowly. "Or about me?" Calder didn't smile. He just looked at her with that same stillness he always carried, like the sky before a gentle rain. "Both," he answered. Mara felt the weight of the words settle into her. Soft, not heavy, not like pity, like truth. That afternoon at the market, something strange happened. A younger woman from town, maybe 30, brushed past her booth, gave her quilt a glance, and said under her breath, "Shame no one ever married her again. Pretty enough if she wasn't so old." Mara froze. It wasn't the first time she'd heard something like that. She had learned, long ago, to let such words pass over her like dust on the wind. But this time, something in her clenched. Not in shame, in defiance. She looked up just in time to see Calder returning with a jar of lemonade in each hand. He noticed her expression before she spoke. "Someone make a mistake with their mouth?" he asked gently. Mara shook her head, but her voice was steady when she answered. "Just a reminder that people like to decide what other folks are worth, especially women past a certain age." Calder didn't raise his voice, didn't glare. He just placed the lemonade on her table, leaned closer, and said so only she could hear. "Funny thing about people. They're wrong more often than they know. You're not past anything, Mara Ellison. You're standing in the middle of your best season." And when she looked at him, really looked, she didn't see a man trying to flatter her. She saw a man who meant every word. That evening, back at the farm, Mara didn't just sit on the porch. She stood barefoot in that unused backfield, the one she'd called hopeless for years. The soil was cracked, the rocks stubborn. But when Calder came to stand beside her, she said, without turning, "I think I'd like to try planting again." His voice came low and steady. "Then I'll be here to help you water it." And somehow they both knew they weren't just talking about soil. They were talking about life, and it still had roots to grow. It hadn't rained in weeks, the kind of dry spell that made the ground brittle and the air dusty even at sunrise. But Mara didn't complain. Not this time. Not since she and Calder had cleared the old backfield and laid the first rows of seeds with their own hands. She hadn't planted anything back there in nearly a decade. But now, there were tiny green shoots beginning to peek through the soil, fragile but alive. But, just like something in her, one morning as they worked side by side in the warm light, Calder paused and wiped his brow. He looked at her, face sun-worn but kind. "You always did everything yourself?" he asked. Mara glanced over. "Mostly." "You ever let anyone carry some of the weight?" She hesitated. "I did once, but when he passed, I didn't know how to ask again." Calder nodded thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "There's strength in carrying things alone, but there's also strength in knowing when you don't have to." She didn't respond right away. But that afternoon, when he went to lift the heavier water barrel by himself, she stopped him. "We'll carry it together," she said. It wasn't about the barrel. It never was. That evening, dark clouds gathered over Willow Creek, soft, slow-moving, and welcome. Mara stood at the edge of her porch, watching the sky deepen with promise. She could smell the rain before it fell, the way the earth seemed to exhale in anticipation. Calder appeared beside her, his shirt damp from a day's work, his expression calm. "You ever dance in the rain?" he asked suddenly. She gave him a look. "I'm not 20. Didn't ask how old you are," he said, grinning. "Just asked if you ever did." She opened her mouth to answer, but the first drop struck her cheek. Then another, and another, and before she knew it, Mara Ellison, widowed, worn, wise, was standing barefoot in the yard with the soft rain washing over her face. And Calder? He joined her, of course. They didn't speak. They didn't laugh loudly or twirl. They just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, hands close but not yet touching, eyes closed as the water soaked through their shirts and cooled the dusty ground beneath their feet. It was the kind of silence that said everything, the kind that healed something old. Later, wrapped in towels and warmed by the fire inside, Calder sipped coffee from a chipped mug and looked across the table at her. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For letting me stay, for letting me matter." Mara looked at him, heart fuller than she knew what to do with. "You don't have to earn your place, Calder," she said. "Not here. Not with me." Outside, the rain continued, soft and steady, watering the seeds, the soil, and the story they were slowly writing together. Not a second chance, but a real one. The rain stayed for 3 days. Not hard or wild, just the kind of rain that seeps deep and quiet, feeding roots too long neglected. The kind that asks nothing but leaves everything softer in its wake. And when the clouds finally cleared, the land around Mara's little farm looked different. Greener. Brighter. Like it had been waiting for something, just like her. Calder didn't say much about it. He just kept showing up. Fixing the squeaky hinges she never mentioned. Building a second bench for the porch. And one morning, without a word, he carved a small wooden hook and nailed it by her front door. She raised an eyebrow when she noticed. "What's this?" He glanced at it. "Place to hang a hat." She looked from the hook to his eyes, then back again. "You planning on staying a while?" Calder gave her that slow, quiet smile. "Only if the coffee keeps tasting like yours." She didn't answer right away, but her chest warmed in that way it had begun to, more and more. She turned back toward the stove and poured another cup. "Then I guess I'd better keep a fresh pot going." It was a few days later in town when the whispers started again. Mara had gone to fetch fabric. Nothing special. But as she stepped out of the store, she heard the low voices near the well where the women usually gathered. "Imagine her age, and she's letting that drifter hang around. I heard he's moved in, no ring, of course. Sad, really. Doesn't she know when to stop?" The words weren't shouted. They weren't cruel, exactly. But they were meant to wound. And they might have once, but not this time. Not after the rain. Not after the porch bench. Not after the hook by the door. Mara turned slowly and walked toward them, basket on her arm, calm as always. She looked the youngest woman in the eye, the one who'd spoken loudest. "I don't believe love has a deadline," she said, her voice quiet but sure. "And I don't need permission to find joy in this life, not from you, not from anyone." Then she smiled, kindly, firmly, and walked away, back toward the man who was waiting with a horse already saddled and a steady hand extended to help her mount. On the ride home, she told Calder what had happened. He didn't react with anger, just listened, then asked, "Does it change how you feel?" "No," she said without hesitation. "If anything, it reminded me who I've become." Calder's smile was soft. "Then I'd call that a win." They rode in silence for a while, side by side. And as they reached the edge of her land, Mara turned and asked, "You ever think about staying for good?" He didn't answer right away. But when they reached the porch, he took off his hat, walked to the hook by the door, and hung it there. That was his answer. No fanfare, no grand speech, just the simplest gesture in the world. And yet it felt like forever was starting right there in that moment. Fall arrived gently in Willow Creek. The air grew crisper, the skies deeper blue, and the edges of the cottonwood leaves turned gold, like flame kissed by time. On Mara's farm, the rows they had planted were full and generous, squash curling near the edge of the porch, beans climbing the trellis like they were reaching for the stories being written in that house. Mara stood at her window one morning, watching Calder split wood down by the shed. He worked without hurry, without noise, every movement intentional. Her eyes softened as she looked at him. She had grown used to the presence of another soul in her life, not a man trying to possess her, just one choosing to walk beside her. She picked up her sewing basket and sat by the fire, unfolding a quilt she'd been working on quietly for weeks. This one wasn't for sale. Each square held a memory. Scraps from the dress she wore when she married Eli, faded blue cotton from her mother's apron, linen from the curtain she'd hung in her first home, and, most recently, a piece from the shirt Calder wore the day they fixed the southern fence together. She stitched in silence, but her heart spoke with every thread. This was not a quilt of mourning. It was a quilt of becoming, of seasons past, of a life hard-earned, of a woman who had learned how to live without, and now was learning how to live with again. That evening, Calder found her still at work, thimble on her finger, eyes focused. He didn't say anything at first, just stood nearby as he always did, patient and respectful of her space. "What are you making?" he asked at last. Mara looked up, a glint in her eye. "Something to keep us warm when the snow comes." He sat beside her and touched the edge of the fabric, his fingers calloused but careful. "These pieces," he said quietly. "They all tell a story?" "They do," she nodded. "And I figured maybe it was time to start sewing them together, instead of keeping them folded away." He nodded slowly. "You're brave, you know that?" She tilted her head. "For quilting?" "For starting again. For letting someone in after the world told you to stop hoping." She set the quilt down and met his eyes. "They say hope fades with age." He leaned in a little closer, just enough for her to feel the truth in his voice. "I say age just gives hope deeper roots." Mara blinked just once, then smiled. It wasn't the smile of a young girl swept off her feet. It was the smile of a woman who had survived, endured, healed, and found joy waiting patiently on her porch. That night, the fire crackled low, and Calder sat reading aloud from one of her late husband's favorite books. Mara curled under the nearly finished quilt, the warmth of it unlike any she'd felt before, not because of the fabric, but because of the man across from her. She wasn't just loved, she was seen. And at 45, she finally understood that some stories don't begin at the start of life. Some begin when you finally believe you're still worth writing into someone else's. The first frost came early. It painted the fields silver and made the old floorboards creak beneath their boots. Mara lit the wood stove before dawn, slipping on a sweater that had once belonged to her father. The scent of cedar and coffee filled the little farmhouse, and outside, the morning sun tried its best to warm a world going still. Calder had already brought in firewood. She found him by the porch rail, coffee mug in hand, watching the mist rise from the ground. "You ever miss the wandering?" she asked, stepping beside him. He took a slow sip before answering. "Used to think the road was freedom. Turns out freedom's quieter than I imagined. Softer, too. Sometimes it wears an apron and makes stew better than any I've had in years." She chuckled. "You sweet talk better than you fix fences." "I don't sweet talk," he said plainly. "I just tell the truth." And somehow that made her heart stir even more. Later that week, a letter arrived, an envelope weathered by wind and distance bearing Calder's name. He read it in silence on the porch, jaw tight, brow furrowed. When he finished, he folded it and sat still for a long while. Mara didn't press. She just sat beside him, letting the quiet speak first. Finally, Calder looked at her. "My brother passed, back in Texas." "I'm sorry," she said, resting a hand gently on his arm. "We weren't close," he admitted. "Haven't seen each other in years, but I need to go, just for a few days. Tie up what's left, lay something to rest." She nodded, trying not to let her heart sink. He noticed. "I'll come back, Mara. You don't owe me anything, Calder." He looked at her, really looked. "That's not why I'm saying it." She believed him, because now she knew the difference between promises made out of guilt and ones made out of wanting to come home. The morning he left, she packed a bag of food and pressed a bundle into his hand. He opened it later, on the trail. A piece of her homemade bread, a note that simply read, "Safe travels, Cowboy," and one square from the quilt she hadn't finished yet. It was the piece made from his shirt, a piece of home, folded into fabric. A message in cotton: "I see you, I'm waiting." While he was gone, the house was quieter, but not empty. Mara worked the land, tended the chickens, baked more than she needed and gave away what she didn't eat. And every evening, she sat with the quilt and stitched another piece, as if each thread brought him one step closer. One neighbor asked her, "You think he'll really come back?" She didn't hesitate. "I don't wonder," she said. "I know. Because when someone truly sees you, not for who you were or who you're supposed to be, but for who you are now, you don't get left behind. You get waited for." It was the first snowfall of the season, just a light dusting, enough to sugar the rooftops, to turn the split-rail fences into sketches of white and shadow. Mara stood at her kitchen window holding a mug of tea with both hands, steam curling beneath her chin. The silence of the morning wrapped around her gently, not like loneliness, but like expectation. She didn't know what time Calder would return. She just knew he would. Outside, the wind shifted, the weather vane creaked, and in the distance, hoofbeats, steady, familiar, like a heart returning. Mara stepped out onto the porch, quilt wrapped around her shoulders. Her breath rose in the cold air, but she didn't feel it. She was listening. The shape appeared slowly through the snowfall. A tall figure on a dark horse, hat low, coat dusted white. He didn't wave. He didn't call out. He just rode toward her like he belonged there. Because he did. Calder dismounted, boots crunching against the frost. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Her on the porch, him at the gate. No declarations, no rush. Just the weight of everything they had come to mean to one another, hanging in the silence like a promise already kept. "You're late," Mara said softly, lips barely holding back a smile. "There was wind on this ridge," Calder replied, stepping closer, "and a stop I had to make." She furrowed her brow. He pulled something from his saddlebag, a small wooden box, aged and carved with care. "I found this at my brother's," he said. "It was my mother's once. She used to say, 'If you ever find a place worth staying, give this to the woman who makes you want to stop running.'" Mara stared at the box, hands trembling just a little. "And did you find that place?" he asked. She nodded. He stepped up onto the porch, close enough now to see the hope rising in her eyes. "I didn't find it," he said quietly. "You built it." He placed the box in her hands. Inside was a simple silver band. Not flashy, not new, a circle that had seen time, but was still whole. Like her, like them. That night the fire burned warm. The storm passed overhead, but inside the farmhouse there was light, laughter, and the quiet creak of two rocking chairs side by side. Mara placed the finished quilt over their laps, the one stitched from all her years, all her scars, all her hope. Calder reached for her hand, not to take it, just to hold it. And in that moment, they both understood something neither had dared believe years ago. It's never too late to begin again. Not when someone sees your worth. Not when love walks in without demand, without pretense. Not when your heart, at 45 or 65 or any age, still knows how to say yes. Spring returned to Willow Creek like an old friend, slow, certain, and welcomed. The land thawed, the bees returned, and wildflowers pushed up between fence posts like shy confessions. Mara's garden bloomed earlier than usual that year. The soil she once called tired now yielded color and life and promise. Promise she had once thought was no longer hers. Calder never asked again, not directly. He never dropped to one knee, never made a grand gesture. He simply stayed, fixed things, built new things, and loved her so gently, so steadily, that one day, Mara found herself setting a second toothbrush in the washroom without thinking, hanging his coat beside hers, folding his shirts as if she'd done it 1,000 times. Until one evening, he found her out by the old barn, barefoot in the grass, watching the sun settle over the fields. He approached slow like always. She didn't turn around, just said, "I used to think marriage was something you did when you were young enough to grow into it." "And now?" Calder asked. She looked back at him. The light painted her hair like gold wheat, and in her eyes, no fear, no doubt, only calm. "Now I know you can grow into it at any age, even when the world says you're past your prime." He stepped beside her, took her hand. "I don't need a church," she said. "Neither do I," he replied. "I don't want white lace or a dress that doesn't feel like me. I want you in whatever makes you feel like yourself." Mara breathed deep, the cool air filling her chest. "Then yes," she said. "To all of it. Yes to you, yes to us." They were married a week later, under the cottonwoods. Just the two of them, a few neighbors, and a preacher with hands as weathered as the Bible he carried. Mara wore a dress the color of dusty rose, sewn by her own hands. Calder wore a clean shirt and the same boots he rode into town with. When the vows were done, and the preacher asked if she took this man, she didn't speak. She simply smiled, reached out, and slipped the silver band onto Calder's hand. Because sometimes love doesn't need words. Sometimes it just needs someone who stayed. Later that night, they danced on the porch under the stars, the gramophone crackling with some old tune they barely remembered. Mara's head rested on Calder's shoulder, her bare feet on his boots, her fingers tucked under his collar. She whispered, "Did you ever think you'd be a husband again?" He answered, "No. Do you regret it?" He kissed the side of her forehead. "Only that I didn't find you sooner." She smiled. "No," she whispered back. "You found me exactly when I was ready to be found." 3 years later, Mara sat alone at the kitchen table, pen in hand, parchment half filled. The morning light poured in through the lace curtains, catching motes of dust that danced like secrets between beams. Calder was out in the pasture, mending a section of fence more out of habit than necessity. His hair had grown a little grayer, and his knees creaked more than he admitted. But his voice, steady, warm, still made her feel 20 years younger. The letter before her wasn't meant for mailing. It was meant for reminding. She wrote it on the kind of morning when the heart feels soft, when time feels both generous and fleeting, when you remember just how far you've come from the woman you once were to the woman I used to be. You thought 45 was the end of your story. You believed the best days had passed, that your worth had somehow faded with the softness in your hands and the curve of your waist. That love was for the young, for the fresh-faced, for the not yet wounded. You wore loneliness like a coat you thought you had chosen, but you were wrong. The end doesn't come when the world says it does. It comes only when you stop opening the door to possibility. You didn't stop. You left the porch light on quietly, bravely. You never gave up on tenderness, even when it stopped knocking. And because of that, love came back. He came back. With dust on his boots, wind in his voice, and no demands on your heart. He didn't save you. You were never broken. But he saw you and reminded you that love, real love, is not about age. It's about presence. So now you are not just older. You are richer. You have a partner who doesn't complete you, but walks with you. You have land that grows again. You have mornings worth waking for. You have a life that didn't end when your first chapter closed. It deepened. And now you sit at a kitchen table worn smooth by time, writing to a woman who needed to hear this. You were never too old to be loved, only too afraid to believe it could still be waiting. But it was, and it still is. Love, Mara. She folded the letter gently, placed it in the drawer where she kept her favorite recipes, and walked out to the porch. Calder was there, just finishing up with the gate. He looked up, smiled like he always did when he saw her, as if she was the first sunrise he'd ever watched. "Tea or coffee?" she called out. He shrugged. "Whichever one means I get to sit beside you." She laughed softly and turned back inside. And as the kettle warmed, Mara whispered to herself, "I'm glad I stayed open." Because love had come, not like thunder, but like roots, and now everything held. Years passed like wind over wheat, quiet, steady, full of seasons. Mara and Calder grew older together, their days filled not with grand adventures, but with the kind of peace that most people spend a lifetime chasing. Shared breakfasts on the porch, slow dances in the kitchen, and the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken to be known. When people visited, they always noticed the same thing. Not the land, not the farmhouse, not the barn. They noticed the quiet between them. The easy kind. The kind that only exists between two people who have stopped needing to be anything but exactly who they are. Mara passed quietly in her sleep one autumn morning, with her hand tucked beneath the edge of the quilt she had stitched through all the years. Calder sat beside her, holding her fingers long after the room had gone still. He didn't cry, not then. Instead, he whispered, "You were my last beginning." Months later, a young couple driving west stopped in Willow Creek. They were lost, dust-covered, running on fumes and frayed nerves. Someone in town sent them to the old farmhouse at the edge of the ridge. Belonged to a couple that knew something about weathering storms. The house was empty now, the porch quiet but well kept. Inside, the young woman found the quilt folded neatly on the foot of the bed. A note sat atop it, in a hand both strong and gentle. "This quilt is made of every year I thought love was behind me, until it wasn't. If you found this, you're not lost. You're just about to begin, M.E." The young woman ran her fingers across the stitching, sun-faded, worn smooth by time and touch. And that night, beneath that quilt, wrapped in a story they didn't yet understand, the couple lay in a farmhouse full of ghosts who didn't haunt, but blessed. They would tell the story years later. "We found love again, in a house built by two people who proved you're never too old to start, and never too late to be seen."